slavery since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come.
Good afternoon. Welcome again. I'm Jeffrey Fletcher, your host for Images of America, African American Collections. And welcome again. This is part 2 of last week's episode when we started talking about the slavery migration, but also we started to talk about the imagery in terms of the shackles and the bondage apparatuses that were used during the passage from the continent of Africa to the Americas. This week's show is going to reflect upon the documents as well as the information that slaves were documented as they arrived to the Americas. On these documents that you see that are over my shoulder, and you'll probably see as the show goes on, they list human beings, children, women, men, all ages, all sizes, all colors on these documents. They were called manifests. And a lot of these manifests were used on the slave ships, and they were used as well in these communities or these counties where slaves ended up. Some of the places they landed on the shores of Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, especially Charleston, which was a big slave import, where slaves were brought in from all over the world by Spaniards, by the Dutch, by English. And from there, that was the point of origins where they were dispersed throughout the colonies. The thing that is really ironic is that these numbers that are over my shoulder of manuscripts where people's ages and their sex and gender are listed. And when I first got these documents, and if you'll notice that they're on big placards. Well, the reason why they're on the placards, as I'm getting ready to say, is when I first got these documents, as I told you in my first episode, I'm not an anthropologist, I am not a historian, and I am not a sociologist, but I'm a collector. So when I got these documents, one of the things I was so enthused about doing was to open up the packages that they came in. They didn't say fragile, they didn't say handle with care, but they were just in regular envelopes. So when I opened them up, I was really, really excited to see that these documents, and you'll see over my shoulder, there's smudge prints on them. So the smudge prints are the oils from my skin. Now again, I am not a curator in any such way. So when I looked at these documents and I was taking them out of their packages, unbeknownst to me, there were oils that were coming out of my skin, out of my pores of my hands. And what you see on some of the documents are big black smudge marks. That's how sensitive these documents were. And until I talked with somebody about the authenticity of these documents, I was then told that from now on, whenever I get such pieces of articles like this, I am to wear protective covering on my hands, which would preserve and to take care of these articles, these items. So moving on, getting into the documents themselves. So after I've had a brief education on how to handle these documents that I was getting, I started reading and I started looking and just perusing over with a huge magnifying glass. And as I'm going through looking at these documents, magnifying glasses, I was seeing that there were relatives, there were siblings, there were families that were just that were on these documents that at some point in time they were separated, they were torn apart from each other as they landed in these shores off the Americas, as I said, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, respectively. And what was really astounding was the fact that they were documented like they were animals. And they didn't have names. And when you look at the documents within themselves, and you'll see where it just shows their gender, their age, and if they were mulatto or if they were male or female. As I'm looking through these documents, I see that they range from anywhere from 3 years old to maybe 50, 60 years old. And these individuals, they were documented like they were cattle. And it was just so heart-wrenching, heart-moving on how these individuals were classified without names. Now, when we talk about the naming of individuals, once they got to where they had to go on these plantations or these work farms, they were usually named after the farms or the plantation owners that purchased them at the market, so to speak. And that's why we come up with these names, and it's not a joke, it's a reality. Washington, Jones, Smith, those were common names that were used back during the 1800s, even before the 1800s, 1700s, moving forward. And a lot of slaves were given the last names of the plantation owners or the farms that they worked on. And today, we still have those names, and people don't realize how far back the lineage goes. And so that's why when we start talking about our last names and where we originated from, some of us, we originated from, our ancestry go far back as England, Spain, the Netherlands, wherever we were extracted from by that country or that nation and brought to the Americas. That was the name that we inherited through the plantations or the work farms that our ancestors had to work on. Later on, you'll see in this segment here, there are also documents that I have that when property was exchanged from one relative, a will was exchanged from one relative to another after somebody had passed within that family. The thing that always struck me very strange, and when I do presentations and lectures, is that when I go over these wills, or not manifest, but these wills, included in the wills would be the slaves, pewter, silver, animals, livestock, linen, farm equipment, and it's heart-wrenching when you show people these documents of the wills that were left by slave owners to relatives and passed down. In these wills, you would see a certain slave or 2 or 3 slaves or 4 slaves that were left after the documentation of a livestock or a cow or chickens or mules. And we just really can't understand how that was able to come about, that people can be classified as property like that. Well, if you had no rights, and if you had no freedom, and if you were enslaved, you came with the property. And today, again, like I mentioned in my first opening segment, the history of the United States goes as far back as the 1700s, but we have decided to pick it up during the 1800s here and talk about the images and the imagery of America. And these documents that you see over my shoulder, they are imagery. They are real. People were kept in slavery, enslaved. People were used as hard or as worse as animals. And when you looked at saw my last episode, or I did my last episode, you will see where the apparatuses to hold people in bondage against their will were used as well. And these are some of the horrific things that we don't want to talk about in America, that we have had a system where people were enslaved and they were worked 24 hours a day. And they were kept from moving about and having the freedoms that they have. And it's important that we know about this type of history, and we can't forget about it. So when you think about it and when you talk about it, these are some of the conversations that you should be having about people kept enslaved. The important fact that I want to get out here is that when I talk to students, they seem to say that was then, this is now. And that's going to be kind of like the mantra that you'll hear me talk about in relations to where we are today. Students and their adults that will say that was then, this is now. We no longer have slaves, and people are not enslaved anymore. That's a critical point. We are not enslaved, and we are not in slavery any longer. But we have to talk about the conversation, and then we get into the conversation of reparations. There's a long-standing debate that goes on around the country through Black America, Black media, is that there should be reparations. And for all you all that don't know what reparations is or are, is a payment, settlement for the issues or the atrocities that another person had gone through. Case in point, if we can go back as far as World War II, I think we're talking some 75 years ago when Japan invaded Pearl Harbor, and we declared war on Japan. The first thing that happened was America decided to round up anyone that resembled or looked Asian, Japanese, and put them in interim camps. Interim camps were kind of communities where they were guarded by troops, American troops. And Japanese, whether you were born here on this soil or you migrated from Japan, you were rounded up and put in these camps along the West Coast. And you were not allowed to move about, you weren't allowed to go about, because you were deemed as a threat to the United States because you had ancestry from Japan. So when we talk about reparations and we talk about World War II, one of the things we talk about in reparation is acknowledging, the first step is acknowledging that there was a bad thing that occurred. And the conversation that happens today, which kind of gets lost in the shuffle here, is that when African Americans are talking about reparations in terms of apologies, in terms of reclaiming property and reclaiming land that is now owned or industry is built on, it seems to land on deaf ears. And I think the only president that has acknowledged that America apologized for individuals being put in slavery or enslaved was President Bill Clinton. And he did make a public statement about that. And the conversation of moving forward to understand about reparations and understand that there were people that were enslaved, people that were kept on properties against their own will, forced to do manual labor against their own will, and sometimes when they rejected or rejected the commands or demands to participate in any type of slave labor, they were lynched or they were no longer to be found. So reparations basically is payment for the atrocities and for the land that had been taken. And I jumped to Japan because a lot of us don't really understand or really didn't know about American Indians the same way. And henceforth, we have casinos, we have federal lands designated for Native Americans to reside on and to do as they please. So I think the conversation now should start to focus on the reparations of what America did to African Americans, and we need to start talking about the realities of these items or these documents that I have been showing in the second episode as well as this third episode of the bondage apparatuses and as the documents themselves, which clearly shows that there were people, there were individuals who were enslaved and kept in bondage on these plantations. you know, this is a real, I say this every episode, this is a real difficult conversation to have. And I don't pretend, I don't make believe that mainstream America is totally accepting of it, because it has that blemish. It shows that blemish that we own. And I say we own because I was not born in the continent of Africa, and I have not been enslaved, but there still needs to be some sort of acknowledgement. And so that's why I am emphasizing, and that's why I am talking about this subject matter, because I still believe we have to start the conversation somehow, in some way. And as you see me in this show and in previous shows, it still is a difficult conversation for myself to be talking about, because it's not something that it's widely accepted. It's not something that's talked about every day. I mean, we talk about what's going on in sports. We talk about what's going on in entertainment. That's easy. But when it comes to talking about things of social justice and why we are where we are today, we have to look at where we came. And that's why I say in my presentations at the beginning, in order to know the future, we have to know the past. And with this, that's why I do these episodes, to try to open the dialogue, open the discussion. I want to say, just going back to these manuscripts or these documents that you see over my left and right shoulder, you know, there are people that are out here that make money off of these items. And these passages or these documents, they come in big books or kind of like ledgers. And there are people who make money off of these items, and they make money off of these items by tearing pages out of these huge ledger books. So when you see documents like you see over my shoulders here, they come from big ledger books, probably about the size of this desk right here. And there are people who own either half of the ledgers, or they own the whole ledger. And what they do is they tear pages individually out. So you get a guy like me who has the shoestring budget, and I see a bid or I see an auction, I'll go for it, and knowing good and well that this money is going to go to the person who actually has possession of this full ledger. But if it takes as many times as I have to bid and to go to that same source to get these pages, I'm going to keep going, because this is history. This is my history. This is my ancestry. So people do make money off of this. They profit. And I'm not profiting off of this. I'm profiting off of it by buying this history and re-entering it back into mainstream to teach, to educate about African American history and the issues that came with it. So when I get these documents, the first thing I want to do is, again, like I said earlier, I want to make sure that I preserve them, but I also protect them by using caution when I put them out there. So when you see these documents in their real abstract form, you'll see them under glass and cage. You'll see them in controlled environment in terms of heating and cooling, because they're sensitive. And my whole being is trying to preserve and trying to make sure that this story does not get lost, or it just does not fade away. There are people who tell me that this was not true, these were not real individuals, these were manufactured. I can't manufacture this. Just like I said in my first episode of the Slave Shackles, I cannot make this story up. And if I am looking or struggling for words to talk about it, sometimes a picture tells us 1,000 words. And these documents over my shoulder that have been glorified to a larger level, they tell 1,000 words within itself, and there should be a panning of these documents, and you'll see exactly what I'm telling you. Now, when you look over here, and you can see how horrific, I have a doll over my shoulder, that a mannequin over my shoulder that has shackles on. Imagine that child, probably the age of 9 or 10 years old. Imagine a child walking around shackles and handcuffs on. And people say, oh, that could not have been, that could not have been. But that's the reality of where we came from. That's the mentality of what we were dealing with. So this is hard imagery. It's difficult imagery. It's going to be difficult imagery. But still, again, this is what we have to know. We have to teach this in our families. We have to teach this in our schools. We have to teach this in our communities. And everybody needs to understand that this is a history, this is a past that we no longer want to go down, because all it does is become divisive. In talking about slavery, I'm going to bring this really back close to home. And the reason why I say I'll bring it back close to home is because I had a great-great-grandmother who passed away at the age of 113. She lived right here in Connecticut. And she was the child of a slave. And she grew up immediately in an environment which was still people trying to figure their way out, free men versus individuals that were still under the auspices of slavery. And when she used to tell us, when we used to go to her home and sit and talk with her, she would basically start talking about her childhood. And what she would say is that it was very difficult. It was a trying time, that she can remember a lot of the people, especially relatives around her parents, who were still trying to make the adjustment of being freed men and women. And whatever they were told to do, they did it. And when I say whenever they were told to do, whenever they were told by white folks that they couldn't walk a certain place, or they couldn't go a certain place, or they had to go to their own separate communities, she said that was the lay of the land at that point in time. And she was a very wise woman, where she held religion very high, and as most people who were growing up in the South, but as most slaves did and was passed down, religion was one of the big parts of their lives. And so when we would speak with her, she would always add in God, she would always add in religion and talk about how God was their savior, how God was their balance through the difficult times as well as the good. And one thing that she never did was to harbor hate, never harbored any type of vengeance. And it was kind of like, this is what happened, now we need to move forward. But at the time when she was telling us these stories, we would say, how could you live there? How could you live in that situation? And how could you not have any anger or any animosity towards the people that told you you could not go into a certain store, you could not walk on a certain side of the street, or for that matter, you could not even be out of your house at a certain time of night, because there were people still, white people, who still harbored that negative, that bitter, that divisive anger that black people were freed people. But there was a way of life, she said, they dealt with down there, knowing that segregation was far apart from where she was. She was saying they had separate facilities, they had separate stores, separate churches, separate communities. And that was one of the conversations that we used to talk about, is how can you have a separate community aside from the majority. And she said it worked. As I said, churches, stores, they had their own kind of policing within their own community. And they had their own community, which was comprised of relatives. And that goes to the point, as I say, and I'll be talking about in the next episode, is the migration period to the industrial Northeast, even still during segregation. But where my family came from in South and North Carolina, the conversation was that families had their own communities. We had, did not break away from the bondage of slavery, even though my grandmother was a descendant of her family being, her mom and dad being slaves. And she had this glow about her, and I'm not saying it because that was my great-grandmother, and I did get to know her very well, but she was almost kind of saintly, where she was a very passive woman, and I know me, had it been me, I probably would have harbored a lot of ill feelings. I probably would have been somewhat angry, but again, as she talked about the conversation of segregation and also being the child of slaves, she never once mentioned hatred. And I think that's what people ask me when I talk about this conversation, when I talk about slaves and I talk about shackles and I talk about Jim Crow and I talk about civil rights. They expect the conversation to be filled with hatred. They expect the conversation to be marred with an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's not what this was about. And I guess I can kind of like go backwards to the conversations that I had with my great-grandmother and now understand why she was never angry, why she was never bitter. And that kind of transcended into me in a way, and that's why I'm here today, is to try to figure out a way to talk about African American history, talk about the imagery without using it as a guise to say it's race baiting, it's opening up old wounds. And I will say that every episode, I will bring that up, that this is not about hatred. And just as my great-great-grandmother taught my brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, that she did go through a horrible childhood in the South, but she did not pass the torch on for us to have any bitter or bad memories towards people that didn't look like us or white people. So here I am today talking about this conversation. I struggle a little bit with it only because there are current things that are going on today that my great-great-grandmother did talk about, and it's funny how we regress or we go back in time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up by saying that, again, this is a very tough conversation. I'm going to continue to talk about this, and I'm hopeful that we will all understand that this imagery that I will be bringing forward every episode and every period of moving forward is not going to be an easy view, but I'm hopeful that we will open up some ideas and some thoughts, and that you'll have a better understanding of the history that I am bringing forward. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for tuning in this week, and we'll see you next weekend. Bye.
I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long